Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sea Dreaming. Thanks for joining us in this session. We have our speakers, Ankit and Daniel, here to talk about the topic how to tame the beast, the untold story of complexity in clicks and code. Sounds interesting, yeah. If you have any questions, you can put it in the live Q&A section in the attach, and we'll review and address your question at the end of the session. Okay, over to you, Ankit and Daniel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Southeast Asia Dreaming. We hope you're having a great event until now and also going forward. Now, before we begin, we would like to thank the organizers for putting such a great event together. As somebody who is also from Southeast Asia, I feel very proud to be presenting at this event. Now, not only the organizers, like we are organizers ourselves, so we know how important it is to have sponsors, and thank you to all the sponsors who make this event possible. This event or any of the dreaming events will not be possible without your support. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Now, going ahead, today we will be talking about low-code automations. Now, low-code is the new kid on the block, but in our eyes, it's a wild animal. And if you don't take care, then it can turn into a beast, which can get really easily out of hand. So today we'll be talking about the complexity of low-code tools and how does it compare with code. Before we begin, I would just like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Ankit Taneja. I work as a freelance Salesforce architect for more than 7 years. I've been in the ecosystem for 10 years now and counting. I co-lead the Berlin Developer User Group, and in my free time, I also like to podcast, and that's why I have 2 podcasts. One of them is called Forcepreneur, which is about entrepreneurship in the Salesforce ecosystem, and the other one is called Via Zindohana, which is basically my way of practicing my German, and which I also co-host with my colleague Daniel. Over to you, Daniel.
Yeah, and my name is Daniel Stange. I'm a technical architect and the CTO for one of Germany's leading regional SI partners, DIA, the Interaktiven. I'm a Salesforce MVP. I'm leading the Frankfurt user group, and you can find me on Twitter. So please connect with me. Let me give you a few ideas what we're going to talk about today. First, I'd like to give you some thoughts why managing complexity is really important. Ankit will then show you how to judge complexity and what the kind of canonical scores for that are. And then we'll spend a few thoughts on how you can keep and manage the complexity in low-code automations, but also in code. And speaking of code or low-code, we think there are some points that we can share to help you decide what to do when and how to make your choices. So let's have a look at the complexity and why it matters. Every automation that is hard to that is hard to understand at the first glimpse is a risk in your system. It is simply as this. If you don't see what's going on in a flow, when you come into a fresh org, for example, and you don't know the flows, if you open these and don't learn from the first glimpse what's going on, it's a risk for you at that moment. And that risk gets even bigger as Process Builder and workflows will retire very soon. That's what we learned at Dreamforce. And this will bring most of the declarative automators in our ecosystem to Flow as a really powerful visual programming tool. So you must be aware that declarative automations of today and the future are not built by trained software engineers. And when things get more complex and complicated, also stability and manageability and predictability of the automations in your org decrease because you simply can't handle all of this, and it gets tangled like the cables here on this patch bay. So, Ankit, what are the common ways to measure complexity?
Sure. So in software programming world, there are certain measures or coefficients, as you may call it, which are used to measure complexity. And we believe that same coefficients can also be applied to flows, because what happens, flows usually get translated into codes, and also in flows, the same methodologies apply. So the first measure is called cyclomatic complexity. Now, you may have definitely heard this from Apex PMD. Like if you're programming in Apex, you could have definitely heard about this, because PMD tells you if your code has a high cyclomatic complexity, basically of 7, I believe, is the default value. So cyclomatic complexity is basically how many different paths does your code take, or how many different paths does your transaction take when we talk about in terms of flow. See, what happens in a programming or in a low automation world is something comes in, some processes need to be done, and these need to be done based on certain conditions. So, and that's what cyclomatic complexity checks. It checks how many paths does your code or your automation or your transaction goes through. Why is it important? Because based on their cyclomatic complexity, you also need to determine the number of tests. Yes, we are talking about flows, and we will come to tests later too. But see, let's say if you take the code on the left-hand side, this has a complexity of 2. That means you need n+1. You need 3 tests because you need to test both the paths, plus you need to test the negative or the other path or the edge case, which is not being covered. So from our understanding, a cyclomatic complexity of 7 is a good number. So if your flow is getting to a cyclomatic complexity of 7, maybe you need to have a second look at it. The other measure of complexity has less to do with programming, but more to do with us humans. Cognitive complexity is a measure to understand how difficult or easy it is to understand a unit of code or any information intuitively for a human. For example, if you take the code on the right-hand side, it's a code which is calculating pi, but it's written in Fortran and written in 1960s. I mean, today you have libraries and you can just do math.pi or math.mod or math.divide and you can do the numbers. But back then you had to go ahead and write the code like this. And as you can see, there's a lot of if statements, there's a lot of go-to statements, there's a lot of jump statements, and that kind of makes it hard to understand. So you should always try to break your code down into smaller chunks to lower the cognitive complexity. And same thing applies to flows or low code automation. Now, just to give you an example, if you look at the next slide, you have a flow which is like this. So it looks very simple, but it's actually not. By the first look, I have no idea what this is doing. I literally cannot even say what are the input points and what are the output points. So you should try to keep the cognitive complexity of your flows also small. So now that you understand both the both the coefficients, we'll go ahead and give you some tips how you can go ahead and keep the complexity low. And Daniel will explain you how.
That's right, and we try to keep our flows untangled, not as the that it ends up like the spaghettis on our slide here. To give you some low spaghetti low code, to use a phrase that was coined by our co-MVP Narendra Singh of Berlin. Now, Ankit started with the visual representation, and I think the most important place to start actually is the visual representation of your flow. There are 2 things to do this. First thing is scale and zoom, the zoom factor you need to see everything, because what you can't see cannot be parsed by your brain and adds to your cognitive complexity as well. So think about which representation of your flow fits the screen best, and also, to come to another point of cognitive complexity, which representation helps to see a linear representation of your code flow. This is the base definition for cognitive complexity. I have put the pictures of a decision tree on this slide. One way it is represented by the automatic layout. That's the thin line that you see on the bottom. And one is the freeform layout that someone has meticulously arranged around the 4 decisions that are taken. Typically, the automatic layout is the better way to choose because Salesforce helps you to arrange your flow in a good way. But sometimes, and you please think about it when your flow gets more complex, the freeform layout helps you to get a more intuitive shape to your flow so that it's easier to understand. That's the first point. Next point has to do with the shape. And that is create lean and clearly gated paths through your flow. Why is that important? A flow can have many distinct nodes, and each record that comes into that flow doesn't have to flow to any of the elements, but only those that apply to the or that are relevant for the specific record. So design decisions and branches in a way that you execute as few elements as possible. And that is important because there is a limit on the number of executed elements per flow at runtime. So the site, there's a limit point of view on your flows, but also a consideration that is cyclomatic complexity again, because if you branch out, quite often you raise cyclomatic complexity, but you reduce the risk to hit the limits, and the limits, as they stop you from doing things, are more important than than cyclomatic complexity as an academic measure. If you do it right, you lower both risks actually. Speaking about transactions and what actually is a transaction in flow, we should divide between screen flows, where the operation between the next button or the finish button and the end of the transaction or the next screen define what a transaction is. And as you can see, this is just one screen-to-screen transition where this transaction happens. So there's most often a little risk to hit any limits. Whereas when you have a record-triggered automation, an auto-launch flow, the transaction size, the number of records that started the flow, can differ from 1 to 200. So even then, the operation lasts until everything is committed to the database, including stuff that you touch when you update parent records, child records, grandchildren, and calculate roll-up summaries and cross-object workflows. All of this happens before the transaction has ended. So it's a much higher risk to run into any of these limits, and in particular, the executed elements limit, while you're doing all of this. Keep that in mind. Lower risk to hit the limit in screen flows, quite high risk, especially if you update child records.
Right. So moving from the transaction boundaries, how can you prevent and make your life easier? So one of the easiest way is, again, this is coming from programming world, you break your down logic or your transaction into smaller methods. Like in programming, you will break it down into smaller functions or classes. And basically in flows, you will break down into apex actions or subflows. So if the number of nodes on your canvas is getting too large, and we will get to that number, you should think about how can you go ahead and reduce it. Also, when you're building your flows, think about how you can hand over the transaction to like an apex invocation or subflow. Now, in the beginning, you might think it will add complexity because now your logic is spread around in different places. But actually, when you look at the bigger picture, when you take a step back, it actually reduces the complexity because each and every action is doing something specific. So when you look at that action, you see exactly what this thing is doing, and then you make out of it, and then you can puzzle it all together. Again, these tips are not just exclusive for flows. You can also apply to classes and methods. Just like in programming, try to keep all your actions and everything crisp, to the point, and readable, and we will come to the naming conventions and that in a while as well. But before all of that, there are some other tips that Daniel will share on how to make your life easier with low-code automation.
Yes, I won't say this is a real tip or but one thing that I learned, and I really find myself violating this rule, is actually bring out the trash before you deploy. And that means while building a flow, you try this and that and this and that and create a variable. And so very soon the elements palette is cluttered with stuff that you don't need any longer. Delete it, please. Before you deploy it, make everything a cleanup. Remove the unused elements, and also if you branch out, consider if this branch will ever be hit by a record. If the outcome is almost impossible or impossible, don't branch out for that outcome. And also use the default outcome for all these edge cases that you don't want to process, so you don't need an extra path, speak, or read another element on the canvas for these things. Looking into the elements palette, here's another good point to again double check for intuitive naming and naming conventions. that's certainly a good point to do that while you're cleaning up your flows.
So those were some of the tips on how you can go ahead and control your code, low-code automations. And now we're going to move and go ahead and talk about considerations. What are the considerations that you can take when to use flows, and how can you make your flows a little more better? And what is the good time to write code? And we will come to that later. First and foremost, treat your flows not just like code, but treat them as code. So be as religious as possible, do the documentation. And just like in triggers, where we say one trigger to rule them all, try to orchestrate all your automations from one place. So try to ensure that everything that is happening on one object is happening at one place, so that it's easy for you to debug when you face a problem. Or when there's an error, then you know where this is starting. Don't make multiple flows on same object, because then things can get wary. Again, determine the scope of your potential. As we know in Salesforce, one of the challenges is we need to work inside limits. So you need to be very careful about how many records are going to enter this flow, or how many records are going to enter this automation, and then go ahead and think about that. So, always think in bulk. You always need to ensure that you know what is coming in and going out. Moving on, there's some other programming principles that we want you to apply is have some guidelines, not just about flows or Apex, but about everything in your org. Like this applies to everything. How do you name your objects? How do you name your custom fields? How do you name other automations? Everything, or your queues, everything. So have some kind of naming conventions and keep it simple and to the point. It's not that hard. For example, when I'm writing code and I'm, let's say, writing a batch class, I'm always saying batch, verb, object, batch, insert accounts, and then it can be for postal code, or badge update contacts for email addresses. And this way, when you look at that name, you know exactly what this class or what this automation is doing. Some best practices you can take from code and you can apply to your automations is, when you're doing some action, use a verb, like, inserting or updating, like whatever it is. Use plural for lists, If there is a list, don't just call it accounts or something, like call it accounts lists, or contacts lists and contact lists for. Don't be miser with this. Give them as good names as possible, which is also the last points that we have. Like, try to avoid abbreviations. Just don't say insert AC or CO or CA. Like, be generous, give them full names. And trust me, I'm saying from experience, when 1 year later you would look at your own automation, you would thank yourself. Because 1 year later, you will not know what 1 year before you was thinking when making these automations. So going ahead, now we're coming to the main part where Daniel will talk about when do we think it makes sense to use low-code automations.
Right. I was just thinking of past me that meets current me and future me all the times in these kinds of decisions that you were talking about. Right. Another decision that we often have to take is, do we code? Do we do low-code automations? I personally try to go with the least complex tool to solve this, and it's often is declarative over code. But I do keep to certain principles, and Ankit and I are going to share how we decide typically. For flow, I typically go for that if I have to write a simple classic before trigger otherwise. A simple before trigger means copying over stuff in a before insert or before update trigger, populate fields in a before insert trigger, all that kind of stuff that typically can bounces just values back and forth, can be done really efficiently and really fast in a before safe record triggered flow. That's what they've been made for, and they really, really match Apex in performance, believe me. The other thing that is important for me in my job quite often is to prototype ideas and show them to business users and get their advice and involve them in laying out stuff. So whenever I prototype, Flow is an easy way to do that, because you can really show this to people that don't understand code, and I can just connect the dots with them and get their feedback fast. And I often collect feedback by letting them do things, which means I need a UI, and the UI can either be record pages, data entry, etc. But if I need to bring up components for that collect data, Flow even has the user interface, and that is really cool. And that helps you to build user interfaces much faster. In general, we have the situation where the interaction with non-dev people matters a lot. And here Flow helps because simply the way it is presented, visual programming is more accessible to non-developers. That's basically fact, even though code, remember that if you write clean code that really reads like plain English, but as a computer directive, clean code can achieve the same, but it's much harder to keep that really clean. Visual programming is always accessible somehow to non-developers. But there are cases where there's simply no way to solve the same thing as efficiently as with codes. Ankit, what are these?
Right. So first and foremost, I would say, now this is a little debatable, like if you have hot objects, and by hot objects, I mean an object which is very central to your business logic. And normally, now this is just not limited to, and every organization is different, but we are talking about account or opportunity. And hot object just not mean this object, but also an object which is child items, which is like opportunity line item. Because in these cases, you always end up triggering other stuff or triggering the parent or grandparent. So if you have a hot object where a lot of automation is happening, and not just inside Salesforce, there is very valid, every company, every org that we see has some or the other backend, and many times 2 or 3 different backends. And then there's a lot of ETL jobs which are happening on these objects during the night, or during the day, or something happens, shoot this out. So if you have hot objects, maybe take a step back and see if low-code automation is the right tool for solving the problem. Again, as Daniel mentioned before, in flows, it's very hard to work with collections. So if you are working with large amounts of data, and especially the power of maps, you don't have the power of maps yet. I don't know they're building, but basically, let's say you get a collection of some data, and then you need to have those IDs to generate another collection. And then my favorite way of sometimes doing things is maps.contains key, or map.contains. So this key value thing that maps offer is still not there in Flow. So if you have to work with multiple collections and connect one connection to another collection and then another collection, then perhaps Apex is your way to go. Now, aggregations are coming to Flow, but they are not there yet. So if you want to do like a count or an average, that you can do directly in a SOQL query, or a sum that you can do directly in a SOQL query, which is not possible in Flow to the limits. And lastly, again, what I just said in hot objects, if you are working with some objects or records which have a parent or a grandparent or a child or a grandchild, and you need to traverse up and down the hierarchy, then it becomes very tricky in Flow relationships. And this all can be done in Apex. Moving on, Daniel will tell you a little more about how to keep things safe.
Indeed. And whenever you build automations, you should wear your safety helmets. That is really crucial, because there's no insurance that covers for damages done by your automations. You should always develop in sandboxes, and visual development is development, even though Salesforce allows you to do that in production. Simply don't. Ankit said that everything that touches a hot object, we can translate this in a more colloquial way. Everything that has bulk operations or could have bulk operations, everything that involves touching child objects. Flow is certainly not the right tool to do this whenever it comes to the heavy lifting and managing a lot of records. Even though it can do this, you run risk of hitting the executed elements limit. Wherever there's quick wins that you can build, Flow is certainly faster and better. Wherever there's heavy calculations involved, think to do at least do the heavy lifting in an invocable Apex method. That is a good balance between code and low code. And as I said in the beginning, it's crucial to manage your path through your flows. So if you touch more than five, maybe even 10 nodes on your way through the flow, there's a risk of hitting the executed elements limit. And because there is a risk, you should go back to the drawing board and see if you can simplify it. If you can simplify it, and there's a risk of managing bulk operations on the in that flow, you should go to do a trigger, because you don't want to have an uncaught exception happening in your flow. And with that, we have just one more thing to share, and that is certainly an unpopular opinion.
Right. So if you want to take away one and only one thing from this entire talk, then this is it. Now, this might be an unpopular opinion, but please write unit tests for your flows. Now, we understand that you're writing flows because you want to save time on Apex developers, or it's hard to find developers, and visual programming is fast. But as Daniel just said before, visual programming is programming. Your low-code automations get translated into codes. So please develop in sandboxes and write unit tests. See, it's not that hard to write a unit test for flows. You just take some data, you give it an input, flows done some processing, you get an output, and you just need to assert the results. So please do unit test for your
also
flows.
du redest
That's
mit dem
the most
Executive
easiest
Board am
way
Montag
to
und
tame
dann
the
kommst du
beast.
uns und
And with
sagst,
that,
okay,
thank you for your
wir machen
time.
das. Also
I
du hast
hope
schon eine gute
we
Ahnung
hope you
jetzt auch,
enjoyed this
wie das alles.
presentation.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Goodbye.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you, Daniel and Ankit, for the presentation. It's certainly an interesting topic, and I can see that we have several questions in the chat.
Klar.
Hopefully, can get the time to get you the answer of them. So I'll go with the time. I think the first question that came in first. Can you explain about the concept of measuring complexity? There are multiple if and else statements. How can we break those things into the flow? And any idea or tips?
That's actually quite a tough thing. If you look at this from the way it is done in code, complexity is always measured in terms of the code units, even code blocks. Like a method has a certain complexity. So it is when you do it in code only and in static analysis only, it is measured per code block, and it's certainly a good idea to keep these blocks of code, be it visual or be it text, as little in complexity as possible, so that you can mix and match a bit of that, knowing that the combined outcome will have a larger complexity. So there's you simply automations will always have a certain complexity. So the key thing is to keep each unit as easy to understand as possible, and that is the most important thing. So if you combine a lot of little complex things into something that is more complex, and this combination is good to understand, you're pretty safe, even though it has a certain level of combined complexity in the end. So probably not exactly the exact answer that you might have expected, but I think it is all about keeping the complexity of the building blocks as low as possible and make it as intuitive as possible.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Daniel, for the answer. Let's go to the next question. What is your recommendation when combining code and no or low code?
A big thing here is if you there might be things that you cannot really do in low code automations at the moment. Note, I'm not speaking of Flow Orchestrator, because Flow Orchestrator is very likely to bring much more variety and capabilities here, but I'm not sure how this relates. So there was a question about Flow Orchestrator. The answer simply is I can't tell yet. When for combining code and low code, I have the impression that it's always good to focus on the things where Flow isn't good at all doing things. In particular, everything that is related to do aggregations or iterating over elements or so, you need to go at length in Flow. And this is a good place where you simply hack your a tiny invocable method then that does the heavy lifting, or working with collections like maps, which are not available in Flow. Therefore, you have to iterate and iterate and iterate, where a simple get element from in Apex would do the trick. Certainly something that look to. And again, it's all about making it as easy to understand as possible. So an Apex invocable method, for example, or invocation of a subflow that has a clear naming and a clear purpose, a clear imperative name, helps to reduce the complexity of the overall building that you build from the blocks that you do.
And one more thing I will like to add to that: when you want to combine low code and code, please write tests, because then you know everything is working as expected.
Not just for the invocable method, right? Right.
Yeah. So that's the main. If you're combining code, right? If you're combining low code and if you're combining code, then please write also test for your low that both the systems exactly them to do, because unit testing will then ensure both the systems are working fine and they're exactly doing what they're supposed to do. So that would be the important point.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel and Kit. And the next question is, any tips on how we can properly manage elements? Example, the naming convention.
There's been a lengthy discussion on LinkedIn just lately. If you look at our fellow MVP Joey Chan on LinkedIn, he recently started a discussion how to name things and how to name low code. It got another boost by Salesforce bringing the object name to the list view for flows in Flow Builder in the Flow. Not Flow Builder, but if you click on flows in the setup menu, you get the list of the flows, and this acts like a list view now, and it has the object that starts the flow. So you certainly don't have to bring the object name in, but you should take a note and bring in the name if you want to start that, what starts the flow, because you can see that from the list at the moment. The before save and after save makes a big difference in terms of limits and in terms of general limit consumption. I typically go for as Ankit explained it in the talk presentation, very imperative names that tell what's going to do. A flow basically is something like a class that should have a concise name in terms of what it does, what object is for, that comes from the list, when it runs, so that you get a quick idea what exactly is this flow about. The old thing of just one trigger per object is not exactly true for flows any longer, as far as I'm aware of that. So it's better to have multiple elements that clearly do some purpose instead of cramming everything into a flow and call it account flow, which leaves you with the large monolith of things. If you build such a thing like an account flow, break it down at the earliest point so that you can clearly see on the canvas. Populate mailing address, populate VAT number, for example. Like these building blocks make use of invocable flows after that, or flow up invocation subflows at the earliest point, if the operation allows. You cannot invoke subflows at the moment from before save flows, which is or is not, that's debatable, a big flaw or a big shortcoming. But it restricts you in to a certain pattern, and be concise about this. What I like, I don't like generic names. I like more concise names of actually what's happening. But if you have a generic names, make sure that the next step, the flow canvas, actually tells the story of what's going to happen.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel.
Many good questions and only 4 minutes left. I'm sorry. That's really good. Keep the conversation going.
Yeah. So I think we'll export the questions at the end, and then maybe we'll send it to you guys. So you can maybe answer it, and then we'll post it in on the website or if that's okay with
the thing
guys.
is, we cannot answer these questions in 4 sentences. We, the questions are very debatable. Like I also see here, do you suggest when initiate a new development on a custom object, stick to flow if possible, but then in future, shall I take that question? Because this is a discussion that me and Daniel also had together.
A heated discussion, actually. Not to call it a war.
So the question is like, when we initiate a new development on a custom object, stick to flow, but if impossible, then in future, if we need to opt for trigger, should we retire flow, or should we let trigger and flow coexist and manage them together on a single object? I think we talked about it in the presentation too. We are talking about hot objects. Now, hot objects can be, our suggestion is like in every org, the whole business revolves around account, contact, opportunity, and cases. Like these are the bread and butter of any particular Salesforce org. Now, we are not saying that you don't need to build flows on this object. Please go ahead and do it. But chances are very high that you would have to at some point start writing trigger, because there's just a lot of logic. And as also Daniel mentioned in his presentation, especially on opportunity line items and of tiled objects, and then we talked about in flows that things take longer to, it's very hard to traverse up and down if you want information up and down the hierarchy. So the other thing is, so the question is, when you're development on a new custom object, I would say try to make an assessment, like how important is this custom object to the business use case. If you think there's a lot of things in future, I mean, of course, nobody can predict the future, but in the moment where you are, take a decision and, have like a horizon of, 6 months to 3 years, and see if you see that this custom object will get a lot of automation, And if it will get a lot of automation, then maybe chances are start already thinking about a trigger. But if you think there's just only small stuff that needs to happen on this object and there will not be like a major thing running on it, then start with flow. And of course, if at some point the time comes that you need to move the logic to the trigger, then again, as I said, if you're writing flows and if you're writing tests, then you know what exactly your flow are doing, and then you can continue from there in the trigger, and then in the trigger you can continue the logic which needs to take. And if there's a logic in the flow which you think will be faster in the trigger, then you can slowly try to move the logic in the trigger. Important is documentation of exactly what is happening in the flow, and then in the trigger, then also writing a small block of documentation which says, okay, there are some automations on this object, and these automations are happening in the flow. The flow names is this, and this, and vice versa in flow. Write some documentation so that the person can see, okay, what is the trigger doing? So it's all about documentation, and it's all about, just ensuring everything is tested and documenting it and giving it right names. That's more or less about it. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ankit.
I think the time is up.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're not able to answer all the questions. But
hit us up on Twitter. Hit us up on Twitter and with the hashtag SEA Dreaming, and then we'll be happy to answer questions. Like, it's early morning here in Germany, so thank you everyone for joining. Thank you everyone who joined our talk. It really means a lot to us. And just hit us up on Twitter. Our IDs are there. And
okay,
let us know and we'll answer.
And we'll export the questions. Maybe we'll send it after the session. So thank you everyone for joining. See you in the next session.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you.
Bye bye.